In a quiet suburban neighborhood, where every lawn was perfectly trimmed and every driveway spotless, there was one house that seemed to break the monotony. It wasn't because it looked neglected or unkempt. Far from it. The house was well kept, painted fresh, and tidy enough to avoid any real criticism from neighbors. But on certain evenings, when the sun dipped behind the rooftops and the cicadas began to hum, something else stirred there. The sound of a garage door rolling open, amplifiers humming to life, and a group of friends gathering for what they called practice. The band had no official name yet, though they tossed around suggestions at every session. For now, it was simply a group of friends who loved to play music. Gritty guitar riffs, thunderous drum fills, and lyrics shouted with more passion than polish. They weren't professionals. They didn't even have a record deal. But they had something stronger than that. Enthusiasm, and a garage that doubled as their rehearsal space. For most of the neighborhood, this ritual was tolerable. The music wasn't blasting at midnight. It was usually contained to the early evening. And while the band wasn't exactly radio-ready, they weren't atrocious either. In fact, some residents admitted, though only in hushed tones, that the rhythms drifting down the street were strangely energizing. Kids on bikes sometimes circled closer to hear a riff or two. Joggers slowed their pace to catch a beat before continuing on. But not everyone found it charming. Just 3 houses down lived the woman who had become infamous within the neighborhood association for her constant complaints, Karen. She was the type of neighbor who noticed the smallest infractions, the kind who measured grass height with a ruler and snapped photos of trash cans left out a minute too long. She prided herself on being the protector of order in the community, though others saw her as a self-appointed dictator of suburbia. When the first sounds of drums and guitar echoed through the cul-de-sac, Karen's blinds snapped shut. She pursed her lips and scribbled notes in a little pad she kept near her kitchen window. She claimed the music shattered the peace and disturbed the sanctity of suburban living. The truth was, the band wasn't nearly as loud as she exaggerated. Most residents shrugged it off, knowing young people needed outlets and hobbies, but Karen refused to tolerate it. To her, the sound wasn't music. It was noise, and noise was the enemy. The first time she filed a complaint with the HOA, it was brushed aside. The president of the board said the bylaws allowed reasonable noise during daytime and early evening hours. Karen was livid. She felt unheard, undermined, and dismissed. That's when she decided she would take matters into her own hands. Over the next few weeks, Karen began documenting every rehearsal like a detective building a case. She logged times, dates, and supposed decibel levels, though she had no real equipment to measure them. She claimed she couldn't hear her television, couldn't focus on her crossword puzzles, and couldn't relax in her own home. Each scribble in her notebook grew more frantic, her handwriting sharper with irritation. Meanwhile, the band continued blissfully unaware of the storm brewing nearby. For them, it was just fun. The garage was a sanctuary where daily stress melted away and creativity flowed. They weren't disturbing the neighborhood, they were simply living their passion. But to Karen, every note was a declaration of war against her quiet, controlled world. She started making subtle moves. Anonymous notes appeared taped to their mailbox. Keep it down. This isn't a concert hall. Respect your neighbors. The band laughed them off, assuming it was just the typical grumbling, "Oh, F suburbia." They didn't know how deeply personal Karen was making this. Eventually, Karen escalated. She began calling the HOA hotline, demanding action. She cornered board members at the community pool, waving her notebook and demanding fines. She even staged little rants at neighborhood gatherings, loudly declaring that some people have no respect for others. Yet still, the board refused to act. They knew the rules, and the band wasn't breaking them. The lack of enforcement only fueled Karen's anger. To her, every rehearsal was now a direct challenge. She paced her living room, blinds twitching open so she could glare toward the glowing garage. In her mind, the house had become an outlaw stronghold, a place where defiance thrived and authority faltered. She convinced herself she wasn't just fighting noise. She was fighting for the soul of the neighborhood. As summer stretched on, the evenings grew longer and the music more ambitious. The band began working on original songs, testing riffs that carried more edge. They grew more confident, and their sound carried just a little farther. A few neighbors even began gathering quietly across the street, sitting on lawn chairs to listen like it was a free concert. Karen noticed this too, and it drove her wild. She believed the entire street was conspiring against her. Each strum of the guitar was like a jab at her authority. Each cheer from the little audience was salt in the wound. She was losing control, and she couldn't stand it. Finally, one evening, she snapped. As the band launched into a new song, Karen stormed outside with her phone raised, recording every sound. She muttered to herself about evidence and authorities. The little red light of her phone camera blinked like a warning beacon in the dusk. She paced at the edge of her lawn, glaring, narrating into the phone about violations and harassment. The band ignored her. The neighbors ignored her. But Karen wasn't documenting for them. She was building her final seat, A's. That night, she uploaded her shaky footage to the HOA portal and filed a formal demand for enforcement. When the board still failed to respond immediately, she dialed a new number, the non-emergency police line. The complaint was simple: noise disturbance. But in Karen's mind, it was her grand victory, the hammer of law finally coming down on the chaos next door. She imagined the police arriving stern and authoritative, shutting down the band with citations and fines, restoring order to her kingdom of cul-de-sacs and cookie-cutter homes. What she didn't realize was that this call would not only backfire spectacularly, it would also set in motion a chain of events that the neighborhood would never forget. As the garage lights glowed and the music carried through the night air, Karen stood at her window, smirking at the thought of sirens. To her, this was the beginning of the end for the so-called band. To everyone else, it was the calm before an unforgettable storm. And sure enough, just as the final chorus echoed down the street, headlights turned the corner. A police cruiser rolled slowly toward the house, its presence commanding attention. The music faltered, the neighbors hushed, and Karen's heart soared with satisfaction. She had done it, or so she thought. The stage was set for confrontation, but what unfolded would be far from the victory she envisioned. The cruiser's headlights cut through the dusk like a spotlight on an unfolding drama. The garage door was still wide open, amplifiers buzzing faintly as the band froze mid-song. The drummer let his sticks hover above the snare, the guitarist's hand lingered on the fretboard, and the vocalist's mouth hung open as the last word of the chorus died in the air. Silence rippled down the street, broken only by the steady hum of the patrol car's engine. Neighbors leaned forward in their lawn chairs, curious and expectant, like an audience waiting for the climax of a play. Karen's blinds flicked open just wide enough for her eyes to peer out, her grin sharp with anticipation. For her, this was the moment of vindication. She had fought tirelessly, documenting, complaining, filing reports, and now the cavalry had arrived. She imagined the officers stepping out, stern and unimpressed, demanding that the band shut down immediately. She pictured the garage door closing with finality, the amps going dark, the kids dispersing in shame. She even savored the thought of fines being written, citations handed over, perhaps even equipment confiscated. To her, this was justice at last. The band members exchanged nervous glances. None of them were hardened troublemakers, they were just friends playing music. The sight of flashing lights, faint but unmistakable in the distance, made their stomachs tighten. Had they really crossed a line? Were they about to be in serious trouble? The cruiser came to a stop right at the end of the driveway. The officers inside didn't flip on their sirens or shout commands. Instead, The car door opened with a slow, casual push. Two uniformed officers stepped out, adjusting their belts, surveying the scene with calm, practiced eyes. The street was quiet enough to hear Karen's muffled gasp of glee from behind her window. She couldn't resist. A moment later, she burst through her front door and marched toward the sidewalk, clutching her notebook and phone like they were sacred scrolls. Her heels clicked against the pavement as she hurried to intercept the officers. In her mind, this was her show. She had summoned the law, and now she would direct them to the villains of the story. She wasted no time in pointing toward the glowing garage, her words sharp and frantic, though the officers barely acknowledged her. She waved her arms, gestured to her notes, and practically shoved her phone in their faces to show shaky recordings of guitars and drums. The band stood frozen. The amps still buzzed quietly, as if refusing to let the night's energy die completely. A single cymbal shimmered faintly from the last touch of the drumstick. Sweat dripped down foreheads, though not from the heat of playing. It was the tension of waiting to see what judgment would fall. But the officers didn't storm forward. They didn't reach for ticket books. Instead, they exchanged a look, one that spoke of amusement rather than outrage. One officer finally nodded toward the garage and took a slow step forward, not with authority, but with curiosity. The neighbors leaned closer in their seats, whispers rising among them. This was no longer just a noise complaint. This was entertainment, a live unfolding spectacle in the quiet heart of suburbia. Karen, however, didn't notice the nuance. She was too wrapped up in her own narrative, already rehearsing in her mind how she would boast about her victory at the next HOA meeting. She imagined herself declaring, "It took persistence, but I alone restored peace." She was too blinded by triumph to see the smirks tugging at the corners of the officers' mouths. The first officer reached the edge of the driveway, stopping just short of the open garage. He tilted his head, taking in the instruments, the wires, the sweat on the musicians' faces. He let the silence linger, stretching the moment like a taut string. Finally, he looked back at his partner, who raised an eyebrow and shrugged. It was then, in that subtle pause, that the tension shifted. Instead of scolding, the officer asked a simple question, not about complaints, but about music. The band blinked, stunned. The neighbors stirred in surprise. And Karen's triumphant grin faltered, confusion clouding her features. The officer stepped closer, pointing casually toward the guitar. The band hesitated, unsure whether to respond. But then, almost instinctively, the guitarist strummed a few chords, soft and tentative. The sound floated out into the night air, not as defiance, but as demonstration. The officer's face lit up with recognition. He nodded, tapping his foot to the rhythm. His partner cracked a grin, and together they stepped even closer, the mood shifting completely. What had begun as a confrontation now teetered on the edge of something unexpected. Karen's jaw dropped. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. They were supposed to shut it down, not join in. She sputtered protests, but the officers ignored her, caught up in the novelty of the moment. One of them even asked about the drums, gesturing as though he wanted to try. The band hesitated again, but the neighbors, sensing the shift, began to clap and cheer lightly, encouraging the exchange. Energy built in the air like static, anticipation sparking from house to house. And slowly, the band relaxed, realizing this wasn't trouble at all. It was opportunity. The drummer passed over the sticks. The officer grinned like a kid as he settled onto the stool, tapping out a few uncertain beats that quickly found a rhythm. The crowd of neighbors erupted in laughter and applause. The guitarist added a riff, the bassist followed, and just like that, the tension dissolved into music once more. Karen stood frozen, her arms stiff at her sides, her notebook limp in her hand. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. Instead of being shut down, the band had just gained new members. Law enforcement, no less. The very people she thought would enforce silence were now fueling the sound. Her outrage simmered beneath the surface, but her voice was drowned out by the cheers of neighbors and the beat of drums echoing down the street. She tried shouting over the noise, waving her arms wildly, but no one paid attention. The officers were too busy laughing, the band too busy playing, and the neighbors too busy enjoying the show. It was supposed to be her victory, but in an instant, it had become her humiliation. The night carries. D on. Music blending with laughter, the garage transformed from a point of conflict into the heart of a block party. For the first time, the band wasn't just tolerated, they were celebrated. And with the officers playing along, it was undeniable. The garage band had just become the neighborhood's unlikely heroes. But Karen wasn't finished. She would never admit defeat so easily. Even as she stormed back to her house, slamming the door with a force that rattled the windows, she vowed revenge. She would find another way to silence them. She would not allow this embarrassment to stand. The band, meanwhile, strummed and drummed into the night, now confident that they weren't breaking rules but making memories. They didn't know it yet, but this small act of unexpected solidarity with the police had set off a feud that would spiral into something far bigger than anyone could have imagined. And in the shadows of her living room, Karen plotted her next move. The night of the police jam session was one the neighborhood would never forget. Photos and short videos had already circulated on local group chats and social media feeds, showing uniformed officers laughing and playing alongside the garage band. What was supposed to be a noise complaint had turned into an impromptu block party, leaving everyone buzzing with disbelief and amusement. Everyone, that is, except Karen. For her, it was nothing less than betrayal. She had spent weeks crafting her case, documenting every detail, only to have her carefully built complaint crumble into mockery. Instead of shutting down the band, the police had practically endorsed them, smiling for cameras while banging on drums and strumming guitars. Worse, the neighbors, those she once prided herself on controlling through sheer intimidation, had openly cheered the spectacle. She had become the punchline of her own story. The next morning, Karen Eski scoured her social media feeds, hoping to see outrage or at least sympathy. Instead, she saw captions like, "Best HOA complaint ever," and "Our cops rock harder than we do." Photos of her glaring in the background, arms crossed and furious, had become memes. One neighbor had even captioned a photo of her scowl with, "Karen tried to stop the music, but the law had other plans." Her fury boiled over. She shut her laptop with a slam, storming around her immaculate kitchen as if the spotless counters and shining floors were personally mocking her. She swore she would not be made a fool of. The HOA had failed her, the police had humiliated her, and the neighbors had betrayed her. If the systems of order would not stand with her, then she would create her own. Her first attempt at revenge came through the HOA once more. She drafted a long, scathing letter, filled with legal-sounding jargon she copied from the internet. She claimed the garage band was not only a noise violation, but also a zoning violation, a safety hazard, and even a public nuisance. She accused them of unlicensed entertainment activities and hinted at property devaluation. She demanded fines, penalties, and immediate shutdown. The HOA board, already weary of her constant tirades, responded with a polite but firm message. The band was not breaking any bylaws. Noise was permitted within certain hours, and nothing illegal had occurred. They suggested she purchase earplugs or white noise machines if it bothered her. Karen's rage deepened. To her, the board's refusal was proof of corruption. She muttered to herself about favoritism, backroom deals, and conspiracies. She began spreading rumors that some of the board members were in league with the band, perhaps even profiting from their little concerts. Her next move was more personal. She began approaching neighbors individually, cornering them on morning walks or at the mailbox. She warned them that the band's music would drive down property values, attract the wrong crowd. and then ruin the neighborhood's reputation. She painted vivid pictures of cars lined up, trash strewn about, and rowdy gatherings spilling into the streets. But instead of rallying support, her words only pushed people further away. Most nodded politely and excused themselves as quickly as possible, while others openly laughed. The band, meanwhile, seemed untouchable. Their spirits had only grown stronger since the police incident. They practiced with more energy, sometimes even playing the same songs the officers had joined in on, which always earned chuckles from neighbors who had witnessed the unforgettable night. They didn't flaunt it maliciously, but there was a new confidence in their music, as though they felt the universe itself had validated their existence. Karen watched from her window, seething as she saw neighbors clapping along or children dancing in the driveway. What she saw as noise pollution, they saw as community spirit. Each cheer, each smile, was another dagger in her pride. But Karen was not one to give up. She escalated once more, this time moving beyond the HOA and local police. She began researching city ordinances, reading through municipal codes late into the night. Her dining table filled with stacks of printed pages, highlighters bleeding neon yellow across lines about permits, gatherings, and sound levels. She convinced herself she was now the neighborhood's only true defender, the lone sentinel standing against chaos. After days of searching, she believed she had found her weapon, a little-known ordinance about amplified sound requiring permits for public performances. In her interpretation, the garage band was essentially holding public concerts without a permit, which she believed gave her grounds to demand city intervention. The next rehearsal night, she made her move. As the first notes drifted down the street, Karen stepped out of her house with renewed determination. She dialed the city code enforcement office, leaving a voicemail laced with legal terminology and fiery indignation. She claimed the band was violating municipal law, hosting unauthorized events, and creating a public disturbance. She demanded immediate inspection and enforcement, but code enforcement was not known for its speed. Days passed with no response. Karen, impatient, began calling repeatedly, each message more desperate than the last. She even hinted that if the city didn't act, she might pursue civil litigation. All the while, the band kept playing. Each session seemed to draw more neighbors, some even bringing snacks or folding chairs. What began as a handful of onlookers had grown into a small but enthusiastic audience. The driveway became a gathering spot, laughter mingling with music in the evening air. Karen saw it not as community but as collapse, an erosion of order, discipline, and control. Her anger became obsession. She began pacing her house during rehearsals, unable to sit still while the garage thumped with rhythm. She scribbled in her notebook furiously, recording not just times but imagined infractions. She told herself the city would eventually see reason, that she only had to endure long enough to win. And then, finally, a letter arrived in her mailbox from City Hall. It wasn't the order of enforcement she dreamed of, but rather a polite notice acknowledging her complaints. The letter stated that code enforcement would review the situation, but that, based on preliminary information, no violations were evident. It even noted that the police had previously responded and found no issue. The paper shook in her hands as she read, her face flushed with humiliation and fury. Once again, the system had betrayed her. That evening, as the garage band launched into another energetic set, Karen stood at her window in the dark, clutching the letter until it crumpled in her fist. Outside, laughter and airs filled the street, and the faint glow of string lights hung over the driveway where neighbors gathered freely. It was no longer just music. It was a community celebration. And to Karen, it was proof that she was losing control entirely. But in her mind, one thought burned brighter than all others. If no one else would stop them, she would have to take matters into her own hands, directly and without compromise. The battle was no longer about noise. It was personal. By the time Karen received the dismissive letter from City Hall, her patience had already been stretched past its breaking point. She had placed her faith in the HOA, in the police, and in municipal codes, only to be laughed at, ignored, and worst of all, humiliated. Everywhere she turned, she saw reminders of her failure. The memes, the whispered jokes at the mailbox, the children who now referred to the garage band as the coolest thing in the neighborhood. It was as though her authority had been stripped from her, piece by piece, leaving her powerless in a place where she once ruled through fear and complaint. But Karen was not someone who accepted defeat easily. If the systems of order refused to bend to her will, then she would craft her own system. In her mind, the garage band wasn't just breaking rules. They were breaking her. And that was something she would never allow. Her plotting began subtly. She started by monitoring the band more closely than ever. Not from her window this time, but by creeping out into the shadows of her yard, lurking near hedges and fences with her phone camera in hand. She filmed their rehearsals from odd angles, convinced she would eventually catch some undeniable violation. Her footage was shaky, full of zooms and sudden jerks, but she treated it like a smoking gun. She also began spreading darker rumors, whispering to anyone who would listen that the band was in core, aging delinquency. She suggested that drugs and alcohol were flowing at these so-called garage concerts, even steal a set of cymbals. It was petty, illegal, and cruel, but in her mind it was repair work, a way to prick the bubble of celebration the band enjoyed. She mapped out routes and times, running scenarios in her head until the idea seemed less like vandalism and more like defensive action. Yet even as she rehearsed these schemes, Karen sensed the abyss they represented. She knew dimly that acting would change her in ways she had no desire to acknowledge. She thought of her tidy lawns, her immaculate flower beds, the years of social capital she had stockpiled through garden club meetings and careful attendance at HOA events. Those things had always been armor. Now she considered abandoning them for something darker. In the end, the choice that broke her already frayed restraint was simpler, nastier, and yet perfectly of a piece with the war she had waged: targeted harassment. If she couldn't stop the band directly, she could make the cost of coming together too high. If gatherings became contentious, parents might stop bringing kids, neighbors might feel uncomfortable, the community ritual could wither on its own. She convinced herself it was strategic, the kind of social pressure campaigns she'd read about in online forums where she'd sought support and commiseration. Her harassment campaign was methodical. She began anonymously distributing flyers around the neighborhood with ominous warnings about noise fines and unregulated gatherings. She sent emails to local school staff, anonymous, insinuating messages that hinted the band's rehearsals were attracting delinquent behavior and unsupervised minors. She called municipal offices pretending to be a concerned citizen from a distant area, fabricating complaints about parking violations and alleged littering. Each call and flyer was a small, detached act, easily justified in her mind as bringing attention to an issue. She convinced herself she was nudging the system to do what it had supposedly failed to do. But actions have echoes. The anonymous flyer that warned of fines inadvertently alerted a nosy neighbor who kept an eye on community bulletins. That neighbor took a flyer to the HOA president and mentioned odd phone calls and suspicious emails that had shown up in a school staff inbox. The school staff, alarmed by the tone of the messages, contacted local police to ask about the source of the allegations. Instead of the band being targeted, the pattern of anonymous harassment put a spotlight on a coordinated campaign, one that could be traced with subpoenas and records if someone decided to pursue it. Meanwhile, the band, for all its newfound popularity, began to feel the bruises of Karen's campaign. Attendance at one rehearsal dipped when a parent nervously announced at the last minute they couldn't stay because of an urgent family issue. A neighbor whispered about receiving a menacing email, and the band's host family locked the garage door briefly to discuss safety measures. Laughter and music grew tentative in the face of uncertainty. The carefree communal ritual was showing cracks. Karen watched this and felt a perverse satisfaction, convinced she had finally created the pressure she sought. But the satisfaction was small and bitter. Instead of the joyous hush of a crowd contently dispersing, she felt hollow. Her victory tasted faint and unreal. It dawned on her that she was now not merely an irritated neighbor, but the architect of fear. The thought should have alarmed her, yet it did not make her stop. Rather, it spurred her toward a final gambit. Her final act was both simple and cruel. She decided to report the band for a fabricated safety hazard. Late one night, she sent an anonymous tip to the fire marshal, claiming overloaded circuits and exposed wiring in the garage, suggesting a potential fire risk to the entire block. The letter was detailed enough to prompt an inspection. She told herself she wasn't lying. She was preventing catastrophe. When code enforcement came the next afternoon, the band's host family showed them every outlet, every amp cable, and every power strip with a smile. The inspector, polite and procedural, noted a few loose cords and offered suggestions: re-stripping cords, using better surge protectors, not a red tag, not an order to stop. The band implemented the changes willingly, grateful for the safety tips. The inspection, rather than shutting them down, provided an opportunity for neighborly cooperation. Another resident offered to lend a toolkit. Someone else volunteered to help wire things properly. The community again rallied in unexpected ways. Karen, however, was not finished. The inspection had not produced the result she sought, and she grew more erratic. She began showing up at the band's host house under the pretense of checking on the electrical work she'd reported. She pressed neighbors for gossip, tried to pry into the band's schedules, and lingered in public spaces longer than was comfortable. Her actions began to register as harassment rather than civic concern. One evening, as the band played a cautious set, a hush fell, this time not from tension, but when an officer stepped into the driveway with a serious expression. He asked to speak privately with the host family, then stepped over to Karen, who had been lurking near the hedges, her phone clutched tight. The look on the officer's face was not amused. He told her that anonymous harassment, misuse of emergency resources, and false reports could lead to legal consequences. He asked if she understood, and in that moment, the gravity of what she'd done landed like ice in Karen's stomach. Her bravado cracked. The anger was there, of course, sharp and immediate, but beneath it was a new emotion she had not expected. Shame. The realization that she'd risked neighbors' safety, that she'd weaponized the community against others, and that her actions might now have legal consequences, shifted something inside her. For the first time since the dispute had begun, she saw herself through other people's eyes. Not a guardian of order, but someone who'd let obsession turn to harm. The band kept playing. The officers left without joining in this time, and the neighborhood watched with a strange mixture of pity and relief. Karen retreated to her house, the last of her plans failing to deliver the catharsis she'd craved. Outside, laughter resumed. Softer and a little cautious, like a wound scabbed over. What began as noise had mutated into something far uglier. Retribution and harassment wrapped in the name of community standards. And while the band seemed resilient, the neighborhood had been scarred. Karen's actions would not vanish like a forgotten meme. They left footprints that required repair. The feud had crested and now teetered on the edge of legal trouble and social fallout. Everyone felt it. The band, the neighbors, the passing officers. Karen sat alone in her immaculate living room, the glow of the streetlights painting long shadows, and for the first time since the music began, she wondered whether she had gone too far. The final act of the saga unfolded not with blaring amplifiers or shrill arguments, but with a strange calm that descended over the cul-de-sac. The weeks of tension had left a residue on the neighborhood, like smoke after a fire, lingering, acrid, and inescapable. Everyone knew something had to give. The band could not remain forever at the center of a feud, and Karen could not continue her crusade without consequence. The community was restless, waiting for resolution. The band, for all its resilience, had begun to feel the pressure. Rehearsals were no longer carefree. Parents hung back a little, more warily, scanning the street for signs of trouble. The laughter of neighbors had grown quieter, tinged with unease. Even the music, once joyful and reckless, now carried a seriousness, as if each chord had to justify its existence. The garage, which had become a stage of freedom, was starting to feel like a battlefield. Yet just when it seemed like the music might fade, the community stepped in. The HOA president, tired of Karen's complaints but also aware of the risk of division, proposed a compromise. Instead of endless garage rehearsals, why not turn the growing energy into a sanctioned event, something larger than one house, something for the entire neighborhood? The idea of a block party took root, spreading quickly through text threads, flyers, and porch conversations. Families volunteered food, kids offered decorations, and even the local police officers who had once joined the band promised to attend. Karen, of course, resisted. She tried to raise objections at the HOA meeting, warning about safety, noise, and bad influences. But this time, the tide had fully turned. Neighbors who once nodded politely at her concerns now rolled their eyes or ignored her outright. Her words, once sharp weapons, now fell dull on ears hardened by weeks of unnecessary drama. The decision was made. The block party would happen, with or without her blessing. The night of the event arrived with perfect weather, warm air, a faint breeze, the scent of barbecue drifting across the street. Tents and tables lined the cul-de-sac, string lights twinkled overhead, and children darted between clusters of adults. The garage band, no longer confined to a single driveway, now stood proudly on a makeshift stage assembled with plywood and borrowed risers. Their instruments gleamed under soft lights, their nerves calmed by the sight of neighbors gathered not in protest but in anticipation. When the first chord rang out, the effect was electric. Applause, cheers, and laughter rippled through the crowd. Parents danced. With children, teenagers swayed and clapped, and even elderly neighbors tapped their feet. The officers who had once come to shut the music down were now guests of honor, singing backup into borrowed microphones. The event was not just music, it was catharsis, the community's way of reclaiming the joy that had nearly been suffocated by conflict. Karen, true to form, stood at the edge of it all, arms folded tight, her face a portrait of contained fury. She had hoped the party would fail, that noise or chaos would prove her right, but instead she was forced to witness the opposite: harmony where she had predicted discord, laughter where she had forecast complaints. For the first time, she was no longer the focus. No one cared whether she approved or disapproved. Her crusade had dissolved into irrelevance. Her breaking point came when the band struck up a familiar tune, the same song the police officers had joined during the infamous garage rehearsal. The crowd roared in recognition, voices rising to sing along. Even the officers, grinning wide, grabbed microphones and belted out the chorus with unabashed joy. Cameras flashed, phones recorded, and laughter spilled into the night. Karen, standing alone in the shadows, realized she had lost not only the battle but the war. Her fury was met with indifference. No one turned to glare at her. No one paused to ask for her opinion. For the first time in her memory, Karen was irrelevant in her own neighborhood. That truth, sharper than any insult, cut deep. She turned and walked home, her footsteps heavy against the music that followed her like a mocking echo. The night ended not with confrontation, but with triumph. The band played their final song, the crowd erupted in applause, and neighbors lingered long after, reluctant to let the moment end. What had started as noise became a tradition. The block decided to host the party eve, Rye Year, making the garage band not just tolerated, but celebrated. In the days that followed, the story spread beyond the Cul-de-sac. Videos of the block party, especially the moment when the officers sang, went viral. Local news ran segments on the band that brought a neighborhood together. Karen's name was never mentioned. She was erased from the story she had tried so desperately to control. The legacy belonged to the music, the laughter, and the community that had refused to be divided. Karen, for her part, retreated into silence. She still maintained her immaculate lawn and her clipped hedges, but the respect she once commanded had evaporated. Neighbors passed her house without pausing, their smiles reserved for other porches. She was no longer the enforcer of order. She was simply a reminder of how obsession can unravel a person. The band, meanwhile, thrived. They gained confidence, booked small gigs, and even recorded a demo. But more than that, they became a symbol, a reminder that joy could outlast bitterness, that community could resist division, and that sometimes the best response to hostility was simply to keep playing. And so, what began as a noise complaint ended as an encore. The music never stopped. It only grew louder, richer, and more meaningful. Karen had tried to silence it, but in the end, she had only made it stronger. The cul-de-sac returned to its rhythm, but now it pulsed with something new. The memory of the night everyone sang together, even the police, while one woman watched from the shadows. It was a victory not just for the band, but for the entire neighborhood. A reminder that sometimes the sweetest revenge is not revenge at all, but joy that refuses to be silenced.